Hi, everyone. My name is Sierra Morandi. I am going to be your presenter for setting up your setting up your presentations for research conferences. So just like a little bit, because I feel like, why am I doing this? So I've presented, I'm a third-year graduate student at Florida State. I've been on a multi-year research grant since I started grad school, and was on an undergrad, a long 5-6 year grant through NSF. So I have a lot of experience with lots of folks and their presentation styles. We have 6 co-PIs on our project, so there's lots of hands in the pot. I've presented across in different conferences. I've presented at NARST last year and the year before and the year before that. I presented at SEEDS and ISLS, ICLS, that's now ISLS, for the International Learning Sciences folks. I've presented at AERA, NSTA, so a bunch of different conferences I've had the fortunate opportunity to present at. And these resources are kind of a culmination from the University of Omaha, from Purdue, and then Florida State. I'm not an expert, so this is just one perspective on just some tips and ideas around like how we set up conference presentations. So like if you have your own that like you'd like to share it, by all means drop them in the chat for everyone to be able to like see. Just a little bit of agenda for our day, or for our hour together, is we're just going to talk about the types of like talk that exist, a little bit of the organization of like what these things look like, because research presentations aren't always like slideshow presentations. It's going to be what we focus on, but there's some other things we can talk about too. And then like outline and preparing slides. I have some examples from a talk from last year, just to bring in some examples of what these things might look like. And then presentation design tips, and then presentation delivery tips. The examples are interspersed. I have some at the end too if we need to. And then our last hour from like 1 to 2, not 1 to 2, from 3 to 4 will be just like questions, and you can work on presentations. And if you have things that you want to talk about, we can talk about them. So the types of talk, we know that we submit conference proposals to like different modes, right? There's poster presentations, there's roundtable talks, and then there's like research paper talks, like standalone papers. And so while these things could be applicable, definitely for like poster presentation, when we think about it, we're going to really focus on the paper research talk aspect, right? With like what we think of when we think of like a typical research presentation, quote unquote, where, usually have like 10 to 20 minutes, depending on, the session that you're in. Our audience is usually like typically a group of scholars. They could be, academic tenured faculty or other graduate students, postdocs. And like that group of scholars, and depending on when you're presenting, like NARST, we're a science community, you don't have to do a ton of that like background information on science education always, because we all are in that similar space. But like when you go to like the American Educational Research Association or like the Learning Sciences group, you kind of sometimes have to background things differently. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Your objective, how I've always oriented to it, is to get people interested about your work, right? So you're not just like giving them a rundown of it, but you're kind of getting their interests in it through your talk. And of course, these talks are not supposed to be extremely comprehensive. You're not putting every single detail of your work into them, but you are kind of giving that like taste of what your research is, so that way people are interested and they want to continue, talking and thinking and co-thinking with you about your work. So just like some general, when we think about an organization of a presentation, whether that be, a poster or a slide show set, it really mimics our paper, right? We have an introduction and a background section. We have, the theoretical or conceptual frameworks. We have a research question or questions. Sometimes that isn't always a question, but a focus, right? Like, what are we doing in exploring this data? I do a lot of qualitative research as like what I'm doing for my dissertation, but, the quantitative side of like, what are we exactly looking at with our research questions? We've got, of course, our methodology. Who were our participants? What was the context of the study? What kind of data did we collect? How did we analyze that data? And then, the findings, our results, which, comprises of what we found, and the discussion about those findings and results. And then sometimes we smoosh implications and conclusion together. Not always in our paper, we have those sometimes very separate, but when we present it, sometimes these sections kind of flow into one another and they're not as distinct, crisp lines like we have in our paper. So sorry, I was so trying hard to mute myself as I did that. So just kind of going through like the organization of when we think of our slides, right? We're going to have a title slide. We're going to tell people about who we are, who our co-authors are, our affiliations. Typically, this is just like a single slide that starts our presentation off. It has a talk, like our talk title at the beginning or the name of the paper to help people orient to it, especially in a session where there's like 4 or 5, groups or authors going. We're letting folks know like who we are, what our work is. And then there's the introduction. Sometimes it's 2 to 3 slides, sometimes it's 1 to 2. It all depends on that like amount of time that you have. And these are just like rough estimates when we think about how much space we're making for these pieces that are part of our paper that we're now presenting on. And in our introduction, we're talking about like the purposes of this work and the background of our audience. Like this might change, kind of like that whole NARST science ed group is already oriented, a lot of times oriented to like when we think about like next generation science standards, we think about like our US education system, or like the reform movement is typically like that big general language that people are like, oh yeah, I have like a rough idea what this is about. But that could change greatly if we're talking to just a general group of scholars, or we're talking more about a methodology and we're just giving the background of the study. And of course, this is also where you're going to position some of the literature in the field. And unlike like when we're writing in a paper that's like all decked out in citations and has all these things, we're picking really salient pieces of literature to focus on if we're going to highlight them. When we highlight them, since we don't want to inundate folks with information, but we want them to understand like, this is where we're positioning ourselves. This is the literature we're positioning ourselves. We recognize that like there's this information and these scholars that have done some of this thinking. And then we also have 1 to 2 slides for that theoretical or conceptual framework. And so, we're providing them what framework we are using. And I have found in my work that using graphics is super helpful in conveying our theoretical or conceptual framework, that they really provide this like overarching picture for the audience and folks to see without us having to like unpack every nuance piece of it. So thinking about these like 3 sections, I think it's easiest to like look at examples as we move through it. So this is a talk that I was a co-author on, and this was just like our intro slide. Since we were NSF funded, we had like all of our little logos of folks who supported us. We have all of the co-authors on the paper, we have the title, we have where we're coming from at Florida State. And then our introduction was really a good rule of thumb when it comes to these presentations and how we create them and we set them up is that we don't want our slides to be text heavy. That's really hard for folks to both read and listen at the same time. And so it's really key to have just a couple bullet points. Usually, the rule of thumb is like no more than like 3 to 4 bullet points with no more than like 6 to 8 words. And those rules of thumbs change, obviously, when we talk about constraints of like time and how many slides we're allowed to have, or if there's something we need to include, or it has to be the full quote or text or whatever it may be. But we have an introduction slide like this sets up the next generation science standards and like 3-dimensional learning. And, we're talking through these points as we're presenting, but we've set it up so that it's something that's quick and easy to look at, and then we can explain and expand upon it. And then we didn't have a research question for this work. It was around teachers' framings and like teacher moves influencing student framing. And so we just have our general like research focus, exploring one teacher's effort to engage in reform-based instruction. And sometimes we use bolded text or underlined text, or we change the color of the text to help emphasize something like really key that we want audience to focus on. And so this is one way we can do it, depending on, also color schemes. Like, I'll be honest, we always go with like garnet and gold because it's FSU colors. So it's like a subtle nod to our institution, but having colors that contrast is really, really important too, especially for audience to read. We don't want like a off-white background with a beige colored text because it makes it really hard to see. And then we have like the theoretical framing. And here we took text and we color coded it to help folks follow through like throughout the entire presentation. We had these yellow and blue markers of doing school and doing science to help folks orient to the components of like, when we're talking about methodology, we use the same color scheme. When we talked about the findings, we use the same color scheme to signal like we're talking about doing school and doing science. And these are what these frames are. And here's how it connects back to our theoretical ends. And as you'll see, we don't cite, you can add your citations to the end of bullet points if it's just focused on the bullet point, but you can also have things at the bottom or like have your general citations like, hey, these are all the people that we're referencing when we're thinking about these ideas. It's not just one idea we're thinking about, but like, all of these folks and these scholars around this space. Oh, sorry. And so then we get into the space of like methodology. Typically, we're keeping it really brief and kind of simple unless we've got this like methodologically rich section that like, this paper is really focused on some unique or, this methodology is really key to the study. It's a really key focus. And if so, then definitely spending a little bit more time on it. But in a lot of cases, our methodology slides are 1 to 2, where we're talking about like what we selected, the context of our research, and our participants. And one thing that's really important here, especially when we're talking about participants, and it's work that I think some of our colleagues have done really nicely in previous years, is like the humanization of these folks, that they're not just like these abstract people who live out in wherever that we've studied, but especially in like the spaces of like teacher education, or even the students within our teacher education spaces, that, we're almost giving, like folks do like Bitmojis and they make little avatars and they give these people like a sense of like humanity within the space of the research, which I think is a really nice thing. It's done really well. And it kind of just helps us make us feel like, oh, like this is a real person, or this is like real people. This is a real group of people. So that's a really neat thing. And that's usually, 1 to 2 slides that we have that methodological aspects and like what we selected. And then we have our data collection and our analysis. So like, what data sources did you use? Sometimes people like put little graphics of like, yeah, we have classroom recordings. Like here's a little camera and we had interviews. So here's a little microphone. And these is 1 to 2 slides, right? You're just giving us an overview, like, what data sources did you use? And you definitely, within the space of your data sources, want to focus on the things that you're going to be talking about in your findings. You're not giving all of your findings. You're not providing all of your information from your written paper, but you're pulling out these key moments. And so to make your presentations cohesive when you're setting them up is to think about, okay, what findings am I going to really hone into during this presentation? And what data sources do I need to make sure I emphasize when I'm talking about, my data collection and analysis process? And of course, you're also going to want to include your analytical tool or lens. And this is, again, a place where like a graphic or having something that's not necessarily all this text is really, really helpful. And so just a little bit. So this is from ours. We were in a big grant. And so we had this really great graphic about like the project overall and what it looked like. And so I think every presentation I've ever done around this project has used this graphic. And then we focus on our teacher, Mr. Jerry, who's this little digital man. And so we walk people through what this is. So our method was focused on like these 4 cycles of PD, and we focused on certain sections of it, and you can highlight them, right? We have animation tools and we have shapes that we can use and provide transitions that highlight certain parts of graphics or text that we're looking at that help focus the reader, focus the audience's attention. And so in this, we could have certain pieces highlighted. And Tier has a question. So I'm just I have my chat up. I realize y'all can just throw questions in it whenever you have them. I have it up to just look and see. We specifically used Illustrator to make all of our graphics. We have some folks on our design team that were. I know that some of my colleagues have used AI, like they've used generative AI to come up with some of their graphics and then manipulated them, which has been really cool. Some of our friends in math ed have used the exponential growth problems, like the Alice in Wonderland things, to create different versions of Alice to help not only with a diversity aspect of helping students understand exponential growth in mathematics, but also to have a fun graphic to orient them to. I know other folks have like they don't have to be these massive, like big things. Like I know that I'm giving you examples of these massive graphics, but we've made graphics like just in like Microsoft Word, where you take arrows and you like add text and you overlay it and you make it look nice. It doesn't have to be these like big wow things, but just something that really helps to convey what you're doing and thinking without having to like copy and paste essentially what the paper talks about. So that's just some. And so then like data sources. So here we highlighted that we had like classroom video data, we had student interviews, what kind of student interviews were, as well as like teacher and student work products. And for our findings, we focused just on one lesson when we described it. So here we have it highlighted that like task 2, which was a classroom video observation of a cancer lesson, we're highlighting here as like, this is something we're going to continue to talk about. So you're kind of signaling your audience to be like, oh, hey, this is something we're going to keep talking about. So this is why we're emphasizing it here in our data sources. And we're telling you what other data sources exist, but you know, we're really going to focus in on this one component of the video observation data across, you know, these tasks. And of course, these are, you know, short bullet points. Sometimes we use transitions. Sometimes it's funky to show examples with transitions because you like click through them, but you have things pop up one at a time sometimes, or you don't have it all available to your audience as you're walking through it. So they're not trying to read and listen. That's a really hard thing to do. And then for data analysis, kind of a similar sense to our data sources, each piece of the data analysis is broken up in that like color coding to help you just like, oh, characterize and describe the different phases of the lesson is one piece of this data analysis. Identifying instructional moves, that was another piece. Analyzing and identifying these themes, that's another piece. So we really benefit from using small, subtle changes in text and color to help signal that like these are different ideas or these are different components. And making sure again that like text is really readable and it's accessible, because the last thing we want to do is have all of our great information and things out and then it not be, you know, readable or accessible. And one thing I will say like that we didn't do that I had wished and I should have had an example of is like the high contrast. So usually the best way to like have text pop out is a dark background with light text. This is obviously the opposite of that with dark text and light background, but it helps for long distance, the visual contrast. So like if you're sitting in the back of the room, you can still see what's on the slide. So then we also have like the outlines of slides. Ooh, I'm reading the top. We have the findings and results. And so this is really the bulk of when we're developing our presentation. So sorry, give me 2 seconds. All better. It's going to be fun on the recording of people hearing me cough. So in our findings results, this is really like, it's like, what is our study like? What did we find in our study? What did we find in our research? What are these really cool things that we want to share with folks? And so I have always oriented to it like, well, what's the things that are like the wow, this was so cool for my work, or what pieces are the most important in relation to either like what the literature's previously said. Maybe it adds on to what the literature said in this really nuanced and detailed way. Maybe it is that you have something that like pushes against what we've always thought, or something like big like that. And while there's not enough space to give all of like your robust nuanced findings, you're really trying to paint that big picture of this is, you know, what was cool. This was this really important piece. This is what we found that we thought was like, aha, look at how cool and interesting this is. And before I move to the like examples, because I realized I didn't pause. I haven't paused at all. Does anyone have any questions? Anything at all? I'm gonna leave it at that and use some wait time while I drink some water.
And for these questions, you can feel free to either unmute yourself and ask, or you can type your question into the chat.
And it's totally okay if not too, because we're here. It's good. We are so good. So just some examples of some discussion slides, same study, same presentation. So we provided some text. So this is like quotations from the lesson itself. My brain is like fritzing out. So we've got some quotations on the slide. We've got some images from the lesson itself. We're still orienting to that cancer lesson that we brought up in the data sources from our data collection space. We've got our key down below, which is cut off because I did not do a good job reformatting these for this presentation, that orients us back to that like theoretical lens. Like we're bringing in these components that, while it kind of looks like a lot, allows us to help figure out what's happening. So we see that the blue text that's highlighted is also related to the doing school frame that we were thinking about in our theoretical framework. We're providing this like overarching theme of like teacher as intellectual authority. So like we're orienting to these larger themes. I know it seems super out of context and like kind of busy, and as it flows within the PowerPoint, it looks a little bit nicer than it does right here, but we're not putting multiple quotes on the slide. We're not overloading audience members or readers, listeners with like super heavy ideas. We're just trying to build nicely, especially to some of these cool ideas like this is what happens in the wrap-up of a science classroom, and the teacher is the intellectual authority in this space. And then we keep building on it, right? So we focus on the theme of intellectual authority here, and then we move on to another theme that we're focused on. And same space, right? We're having text, and this is an example of like poorly colored text, like this light green text or medium green colored text on this white background is hard to see. Like you can look at it up close and it's nice, but it's not always the easiest to see from a distance. And again, it kind of does that work of like pieces that continue to stay on the slide. So like, say you have like the cancer lesson key at the bottom. You want to make sure that that stays in the same position on every slide and doesn't jump, because it can become a distraction to your audience members and your listeners. The text itself, right? Like we're highlighting just one component. We have all of it. And if we're going to have all of it, we need to make sure we have the time that either we're giving people a synopsis of what's happening in the text that we're not reading, or we read all of it aloud. I've definitely learned from presenting that standing there awkwardly can sometimes be like uncomfy. And sometimes we don't want to always read everything on the slide, but if we're going to put big quotes, it's usually a good idea to read them aloud or to provide a general synopsis of it if it's too much that we're reading and we just want to highlight a couple things. That's how we can use our bolded text too, to just highlight one or two things out of a large body without just breaking out those small pieces, because we're trying to tell a story, or we're trying to come across with these ideas and we want them to be cohesive in nature. And then we have our discussion slides. And so this is 1 to 2 slides that kind of focus on like, so what do our findings mean, right? Just like in your paper, the discussion is meant to kind of tie together what your findings were with the literature that you've already brought in. And so, and I left this in here, but like you're giving folks a taste of your research. You're doing that through all of this. So like, what are some really key points of your discussion that you need to pull from your paper and bring forward in your presentation? And how does it connect back with your introduction? Or is there a key point that you're making almost like the bookends of your presentation, much like your paper? You're trying to get something across. So what is this thing that we are really, really, really interested and focused on? And what does it mean for, our larger spaces and what we're thinking, whether it's in teacher education or student emotions or whatever space of research it's in. And that's usually 1 to 2 slides. Sometimes it can be 3, depending on like the nature of the findings themselves. And then we have our implications and conclusions. And kind of like I said earlier, while in our paper, they're sometimes like separate sections. In our presentations, they sometimes get smooshed together. Pushed together. And so sometimes this is like, where does this leave us? Like, what are these next, what does this research mean for this space? And like, where are we going with it? And sometimes it also includes our future research. So sorry, give me 2 seconds. So sometimes we kind of cover all of those pieces together. Where does this leave us? What's the big picture? What comes next is kind of that wrap up. And sometimes our research doesn't have, we don't always hone into that future research. I have always left it at the end in case I crunch for time. And then I know that like, I can cover this later. This can be something if someone asks me like, well, what comes next, that like I can come back to this future research slide. And so I usually parse them out, and I have my implications and conclusions together on one side, and then my future research on its own slide at the end. Just in case I don't get to it, I know that I can leave on my conclusions and know that I've wrapped up my presentation for my audience. And so sometimes our discussion, we switch colors for our discussion. It was something that we did as a research team, like the format of like the headers, they were all red before, red or yellow, and they were blue for our discussion to help us parse apart what pieces we were focusing on and how much space we were using for each one. And so in this, it kind of gave like this big overview of, in our data analysis, we talked about like these different parts of the lesson. So like we've got the different parts of the lesson that we're talking about in our discussion. We brought in, nothing new here. This is like taking all of our findings and pushing them together, making sense of them. And so there's nothing new that we're adding here in our discussion, much like our paper, but we are putting them together in a way. So we're orienting to these like 3 actors that exist within these spaces in this page. And we're bringing in those big themes that we had that were separate slides during the findings to this like whole thing and trying to paint a really big picture. It's almost like that 1,000-foot view of like, wow, look at all these pieces together and how they fit and what they mean. And so for us, we had a couple of these slides that like built to this, and this was like the last slide that we looked at. And then our conclusion and our implications were pushed together. And so again, we were super graphical heavy because it helped us to convey what we were trying to do. And we brought back all of those components we talked about. So we brought back in our theoretical framework at the end to make sense of like, we want students to be in this doing of science frame. And I just lost my little box. There we go. We wanted students, right, to be in this doing science as sense maker frame and look at these different actors, look at these different parts of the lesson, and we're trying to paint this cohesive summary of like, what is it? And in this, we were also making the point to talk about like, well, what does this mean? Like, where are we going next as far as what are these implications? What does this look like? And so, since we were focused on PD, we talked about, PD developers, they need to consider contradictory messages and major actors and impacts of wrap up. And so, and Christopher, that's a really good question. Christopher asked, what really works, the graphics or the verbal explanation? I found it's a combination of the two. You have to, if you over create graphics to where like you don't need an explanation, then chances are it's a lot for your listener to like look at and listen to. And so providing something that requires you to verbally explain, but has components that like that you carry through the presentation, so like color schemes or like specific like sometimes we use circles because we like overlapping things. So like we'll have 3 circles that we carry on or components that we highlight. So then when we come to the conclusion, we're able to like verbally explain what this looks like and means. That saying though, that like graphics that are not self-explanatory, but like have a lot of information in them can be really, really helpful, especially when the ideas that we're working with are really complex and intertwined and we need help trying to parse that apart, not just like verbally, but like graphically. I think of like, there's folks who do like the wayfaring graphics and like they look like a net and like this like wave, and it's super neat to think and consider like, you can make sense of the graphic by itself, but with the explanation, it really has such a deeper impact and meaning. So there's, and this is like not so helpful, but like there's a sweet spot between your graphic and your verbal explanation. And so it's finding really what works for you and what's best for you. Maybe you do really like having to give like a really deep, in-depth verbal explanation, but that doesn't mean that you can't have a graphic that also does some of that work. So I hope that was helpful. With it. And I like speed through things because I talk a mile a minute and I'm very sorry. But just like some overall tips when we're preparing slides. And so we want to organize our slides to emphasize the big picture of our research. We all have lots of really like cool, sometimes small things that don't always get to be emphasized in our presentation, unfortunately. And so we want folks to be interested and want to get to learn those really cool and, sometimes like it's not that they're less important, but like they're not your main focus of your work. And so this is kind of how like you entice people, like you want to read my proposal after you've like seen this presentation kind of thing. or you want to read the manuscript, or you're really interested in these ideas, or you want to co-think around these things. It's how I've always oriented to presentations. It's not just sharing our research, but also like getting people excited about what we do. We want to use short and clear bullet points. There's sometimes a rule of thumb of no more than like 3 to 4 bullet points. Again, like a 6 to 8 words, because sometimes it gets overwhelming. And you don't want to use complete sentences, which seems really funky, but when we think about complete sentences, right, like those are going to be more than 6 to 8 words. And that can then lead to like really text heavy slides that we're then reading. And we want to fill in the details verbally. So audience members, they can only read or listen, not both. You're not going to be able to, especially at conferences when, you are like oversaturated in all these thinkings and like, all this work, that to then read, you're not going to tune into the listening, or you're going to tune into listening and you're going to miss something. Say, you're preparing, you have slides and you have all this text and you're like, okay, my participants are going to read this, but then I'm going to talk about it with them and they're not going to get to read it all. You're going to lose some of that. So the less is more kind of space is always good when we're creating slides, especially because we know our studies inside and out, or we're with co-authors who like we're all, collaborative and working together for this goal. And so, you're not the only person who's going to answer questions or support the work. And that means that, not saying that you have to go super light on the text, because right, you want things that are visually appealing and you want to have words on your slides, but you'll always be able to verbally explain details in a way that you don't have to have every single thing on your slides. I live for the speaker notes. I don't always use them, but they're really good because if you ever get stuck or you forget what you're supposed to talk about, you've got something there to have. I know some of my colleagues are like, I have to write all of the things out in my speaker notes. I get lost because my eyes can only track so far on the page. So I usually typically make like 4 to 5 bullet points a slide if I know I need to remember something or there's something key I want to talk about here that I'm not presenting on the slide itself, but maybe it's part of the graphic. And that's worked really well for me. And then like also too, right, you're setting up the presentation, like delivery is also really big. And so practicing is really important. You want to make sure that you're within the time limit for your presentation. You like going over, it stresses me out. I don't know about the rest of y'all, but it stresses me out so much. Like I'm so fearful that like I'm going to get stopped and I'm not going to get to explain something and I'm going to miss something really important. And so practicing and making sure you're within that time limit can be really critical, especially when you're like planning for the presentation and you're like, okay, I've planned for, 15 slides for a 10 to 12-minute presentation. What does that actually look like? Where do I need to, cut slides or condense things? Or maybe it's that there's so much on a slide that you spend so much time and you need to break it apart. Additional slides can be put at the end of your presentation in case of questions. I know that I like do this all the time. I will put way more than I need to in the actual presentation. And then I'll practice and I'll be like, ooh, I need to like cut 4 or 5 slides. And instead of deleting the slides, because, you spent time and energy preparing these slides, you've worked really hard on this work, that you can just move them to the end of your presentation. Because 9 times out of 10, if you were thinking about it and you thought it was critical to have within your presentation in the first place, there could be a question about it. And so it kind of just becomes that like it feels like an appendix almost, like, look, I have this other table that's like really helpful for explaining this like one really detailed piece of my findings that I wanted to, didn't have time for in the actual presentation, but someone's now asked a question about it and you can flip to it. That doesn't mean you need to make everything a slide and have it in case of backup, but sometimes when we put in a lot of work, I know like I have like a text graveyard for when I do proposals. Like I don't want to delete you because I like worked so hard and thought so hard on this. And the same goes for presentations, right? You've worked hard, you've spent time with it, and it feels funky to maybe delete. So moving it to the end is always a space for it, just in case. It's like your presentation graveyard area. Much like when we write proposals, there's negotiation when we deliver our presentations as well. So you'll definitely want to talk with your co-authors or co-collaborators to figure out which sections you're going to be presenting on. So, even if you're lead author and you're like, yeah, maybe I'm not like, maybe I want, author B to help me present, or like have also agreed to present. And so negotiating and making sure you're comfortable with what you're presenting on. You definitely, I know it's like first year graduate student, it was like, here, present on this. And I'm like, I have absolutely know what I'm presenting on. Like, please don't make me do this. So just talking and negotiating what you're going to be doing, and making sure, and then also getting feedback from peers. I know as a graduate student, like I've gone and, harassed my advisor multiple times and been like, can I present this for you to make sure that I like sound and am functioning well? And like she times me as well. And so that can be really, really helpful as far as just feeling more confident. The more you practice, the more you feel comfortable, the smoother presentations go. And don't be stressed. Let me rephrase that. We're all going to be stressed. Presentations can be stressful, but try not to let that stress overwhelm you as you're, working through the creation and the delivery of your presentation. And that was pretty much it. I'll be honest, I like breezed through that a smidge faster than I probably should have. So I do apologize. I could have talked a smidge slower, but does anyone have any questions or wonderments? We have a form, not a Google. We have a form on the session, like we have with all the other sessions. It's our last one in the series. And so this is it. So we'd like to, of course, hear. And that is a fantastic question. How would this information transfer to a research poster? I'll say most of the things that I do in presentations, I also do in research posters, in the sense that like it's not text heavy. There's a lot more cohesive sentences. You want sentences, you have this cohesive nature of like full paragraphs. However, you're not going to be like copy and pasting your whole research proposal, right? Like you want things to be cohesive and flow naturally. And if you're just copying and pasting big chunks, that doesn't always happen. Graphics work really well, as well as tables, especially when we're talking about like data or findings. Sometimes a table helps orient us to it, whether it's qualitative or quantitative or mixed methods. If we can put it in some format that makes it accessible to look at, that is super helpful. Graphics also for like participants and like pieces of like frameworks help to make sense. Like if we have thinking like pedagogical content knowledge, right? So that is like its own structured framework that we can, bring in and adapt and change to be that, right? Like math, pedagogical content knowledge is like an egg shape. And so we can take that egg shape, something that's known, these pieces, these places in graphics that we know, and move them in. Professional development graphics too, we can change and adapt these things. So very similar. And I will say, because I realized I didn't have a slide on it, but like references, some folks are really, really adamant about having their references at the end of their PowerPoint slide. Some just have like their almost like their in-text that are on the slide. And then like they link either like the full proposal at the end of their presentation via QR code, or they have some like way to access the full proposal. People do that also on research posters. That's a really big thing that I've noticed in the last year is folks would have their references list as a QR code instead of having just like key references on their posters. They'll have components where, it's the study, right, put out on the poster, and then they have the QR code to like the whole proposal, or they have the QR code to their references. So it's reformatting to make more space sometimes for these more, not that our references aren't important, but these more like salient project or study focused pieces, and then having like that additional information accessible via some other mode or method. I know a lot of folks have been using QR codes. They've been really fantastic to like getting access to whole proposals, especially in like your PowerPoints and your posters. And same for like roundtable talks too. Like folks usually have like 1 to 2 page graphics for roundtables, and those graphics, 1 to 2 page graphics, 1 to 2 page like synopses, or they have like printouts. And they're usually not really big handouts, because roundtables is kind of like massaging ideas. Sometimes they're not full manuscripts. Sometimes they're not like full projects yet, but they're getting there, or they're in that process, or maybe they are all the way through manuscript and there's, revisions and things that are going on. But folks have really like honed into like, if they're going to include data that they want to focus on, that they can do it, like having a Google folder for it, or having something where others, we're always on our technology. And so it makes it really easy to be able to connect with folks and see what they're seeing in a way that's nice. But yeah, that is where we're at.